She thought she was going to get a red buzzer?
In June 2018, a 13-year-old girl from a tiny village in the north of England walked onto the America's Got Talent stage and could not look up from the floor. She whispered to the judges that she suffered from stage fright. She looked like she might turn around and walk back through the curtain at any moment. Mel B had to coax her just to begin. Then the music started, and everything that had seemed certain about that moment stopped being certain. The shy, trembling girl vanished somewhere inside the first few bars of Otis Redding's Hard to Handle, and what replaced her left four experienced judges scrambling for words. Simon Cowell said something under his breath the microphones caught anyway. Howie Mandel was already on his feet and moving toward the golden buzzer before the song had finished. Within 7 days, the audition video had been watched more than 130 million times. Within months, that number would pass 250 million. The girl who had barely been able to speak became one of the most talked about performers on the planet overnight. And the industry that came rushing toward her with contracts and promises was about to teach her lessons that no television competition could have prepared her for. The weeks that followed the audition only deepened the promise of what was coming. Courtney moved through the quarterfinals, the semifinals, and into the finale with performances that kept raising the ceiling on what audiences expected from her. She performed James Brown and Steppenwolf and Janis Joplin with a physical commitment and emotional rawness that made viewers forget she was still in school. All four judges gave her standing ovations. Howie Mandel predicted she would win every time he spoke about her. Simon Cowell described watching her shake like a leaf before the music started and then transform the instant it did, and said that duality was exactly why he loved her. By the night of the finale, the consensus was close to unanimous. Courtney Hadwin was going to win America's Got Talent Season 13 and everything that came with it. When close-up magician Shin Lim was announced as the winner and Courtney finished in 6th place, the gasps from the Dolby Theater audience were audible enough to make it into press coverage. Fans flooded social media calling the result impossible. But the elimination, as devastating as it felt in that moment, turned out to be far from the most damaging thing that was about to happen to her. Simon Cowell moved fast after the finale. By December 17, 2018, barely months after the season ended, the announcement was made. Courtney had signed a multi-record deal with Psycho Music in partnership with Arista Records. She was 14 years old, and she told journalists she felt super excited and lucky. Cowell said publicly that he would never forget her first audition, and that he was looking forward to working closely with her. The deal looked like the beginning of everything. What it actually was became clear before she turned 16. Psycho Music was already in the process of winding down its operations. The structural collapse of the label meant that the support system Courtney had been promised simply ceased to exist. The deal dissolved. The team disappeared. And she found herself, at 15, in a position she would later describe as harder than anything she had faced before the show had made her famous. She said she felt a constant pressure to prove herself more every single day, and that the label collapse had left her more exposed and more vulnerable than she had been before any of it started. Before the label fell apart, she had already been given a preview of what the industry intended to build around her, and it had nothing to do with who she actually was. She was placed in large writing camps with producers and songwriters who had been given a brief that bore no relationship to the music that had made her extraordinary. She was handed songs to perform that she later described as pure Ariana Grande pop. The problem was not that pop music was inferior. The problem was that Courtney Hadwin had found her musical identity by watching black and white footage of James Brown, Tina Turner, Etta James, and Aretha Franklin. The specific moment she understood what she wanted to do with her voice came from watching a black and white performance of James Brown doing I Got You, and that moment had nothing to do with polished modern pop production. Her sound was soul and blues and rock and roll, physical and raw and rooted in a tradition several decades older than she was. The industry looked at all of that and decided what she really needed was to sound like the charts. She went into session after session being handed material she could not connect with, being shaped into something that had been designed for someone else entirely, and the further that process went the more disconnected she became from the version of herself that had stopped the room cold in 2018. The rescue came in the form of a producer named Kevin Bowe, whose work included credits with Etta James and Joe Cocker, musicians who lived inside the same tradition Courtney had always been drawn toward. With Bo, the process was different from the beginning. He encouraged her to actually write alongside him, to bring her own perspective into the room rather than receive finished material and learn to perform it convincingly. Songwriting had not come naturally to her. She had always thought of herself primarily as a live performer, someone whose gift expressed itself on a stage rather than behind a notepad. But working with Bo gradually changed her relationship with writing, and the change was significant. She began to understand that the only path to music that genuinely represented her ran directly through her own pen. She started building what would eventually become her debut album around the age of 15, and the writing functioned as a record of everything that was happening to her during the years when the public had largely assumed she had walked away from music entirely. Between 2019 and 2022, from the outside, the disappearance looked complete. The girl with the most watched audition in Season 13's history had vanished from public view. The label had folded. The writing camps had produced nothing she recognized as herself. Her social media presence contracted. Fans speculated that she had quit. What they did not see was that she was spending those years, from 15 to 18, writing songs that processed everything the industry had done to her and everything fame had cost her. She described songwriting during that period as the only real outlet available to her, the place where she could express what she was not equipped to articulate in conversation. The songs she wrote were not about performances or audiences or standing ovations. They were about what happened in the silence after all of that went away, about navigating an industry that had processed her and partially discarded her while she was still a teenager, about trying to figure out who she was when the structure that had promised to support her had collapsed. The accusations that had been following her since the audition made every part of this harder. Within hours of the June 2018 broadcast, someone discovered footage of her on The Voice Kids UK from 2017, where she had performed with visible confidence and reached the top 6. The comparison between that Courtney and the girl who had barely been able to speak to the AGT judges was immediately framed as evidence of deception. Online commenters called her a fake. They said the stage fright was manufactured for shock value, that the transformation was calculated, that the entire performance had been a manipulation. The accusation that she had faked her nerves spread faster than any clarification could follow it. No one paused to note that AGT had no rule against contestants with prior competition experience, or that being genuinely nervous in a different country in front of a different panel at a younger age was entirely consistent with having performed confidently elsewhere before. The internet wanted the story of the calculated fraud, and that story moved faster than the facts that undermined it. Her grandfather Tom's story went to the press to defend her, explaining that the family had deliberately chosen AGT over Britain's Got Talent because they believed the American audience would connect with her rock and roll energy in a way the UK audience had not. He was right about the reception. Nobody had calculated for the backlash. Courtney herself responded publicly with a composure that read as older than 14. She said she had learned not to look at the negative comments and to focus on the people who had supported her. She thanked her voters and said she would not have reached the finale without them. It was a generous answer from someone who had just been accused of fraud by millions of strangers. The accusations did not leave. They followed her through the years, resurfacing reliably whenever she did something that did not fit the image people had decided she permanently occupied. At school in Heselden, the bullying was more immediate and more personal. Classmates mocked her voice and taunted her at a time when she was supposed to be celebrating a global breakthrough. Her parents had worried about this specifically, knowing that the kind of attention she had received could make the immediate environment more hostile rather than less. There is no protection from the people you see in the corridor every morning, regardless of how many millions of strangers are celebrating you online. Even years earlier, when she had buskied across the northeast of England to fund her own singing lessons as an 11-year-old, the adults working the same streets had asked her to move away. Her grandfather described how shopkeepers and passers-by loved her, but the other buskers resented her because she drew the crowds to her corner and away from theirs. An 11-year-old child paying for her own education was being pushed out by adults who experienced her talent as a threat to their income. The dynamic had announced itself early. The pressure that proved most persistent over the years came from something harder to confront than specific incidents of cruelty. As she grew up, as any person grows across the years between 13 and 21, the public demonstrated with increasing clarity that it did not want her to She described in interviews how people wanted her to stay as that 13-year-old girl, how every time she posted something that reflected the woman she was becoming, the responses pulled the conversation back to the audition and demanded the version of her that existed inside those 4 minutes. The song You Only Love Me When I Lie emerged directly from that frustration. She described sending Kevin Bowe a message saying she needed to write about exactly this, about people refusing to release their fixed image of someone and demanding performance of that image instead of actual presence. The song became one of the most important tracks on the album, described by critics as her rawest and most emotionally precise work. Little Miss Jagged was released in September 2025 after nearly a decade of writing. She had started it at 15 and finished it at 20. Every song carried the accumulated weight of the years between those two ages, the label collapse, the writing camps, the accusations, the bullying, the years of trying to make music that sounded like her in an industry that kept suggesting she should sound like something else. She described the album as a diary, a form of therapy, and the most honest thing she had ever made. It was the product of creative control she had never been given at Psycho, built with a producer who understood what she was actually trying to say. 1 month after the release, she performed at Festival Vila in Portugal in an outfit that reflected the woman she had spent years becoming rather than the child the audience had decided she permanently was. She wore a cropped white shirt, a red tie, fishnet stockings, and a bold stage look that she later described as a deliberate statement about no longer being the kid everyone wanted her to be. Within hours, the outfit went viral for the wrong reasons. More than 200 mocking messages arrived in a single day. The accusations from 2018 reappeared. People said she was desperate for attention. They dissected her appearance and her choices with exactly the contempt she had spent 6 years writing songs about. The cruelty of the response proved her point with a precision that was almost too neat to be believed. She had survived the collapse of her deal. She had found her sound and her producer. She had written her own album on her own terms and released something she was genuinely proud of. And when she showed the world who she had become, the world told her to go back to being 13. She was 21 when Little Miss Jagged reached listeners. The title is an honest description of the path. Jagged, uneven, full of sharp edges and unexpected turns. Nothing like the smooth trajectory the audition suggested was waiting. But she has said clearly that she is writing for herself now, that she could not care less what people think, and that anyone who connects with the music along the way is a welcome addition rather than the goal. The girl who could not look up from the floor in 2018 has become someone who knows exactly where she is going. Whether the world that made her famous is ready to follow her there is, finally, no longer her problem to solve.